November 18th, 1942. Above Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, an unnamed Japanese Zero pilot gripped his control stick and stared upward in disbelief. Climbing from the airfield below were strange, twin-boomed American fighters. Aircraft his own intelligence officers had dismissed as too heavy, too clumsy to matter. They were wrong. Within minutes, those fighters had climbed past his altitude, past the ceiling his beloved Zero could ever hope to reach for 3 years. The rising sun had ruled the Pacific sky. No Allied fighter could outturn a Zero. No Allied pilot could outclimb one. That morning, both of those certainties died. Somewhere over that blood-soaked island, a new kind of war was being written into the clouds. One measured not in courage or in turning circles, but in horsepower, altitude, and cold mathematics. Within a year, Japan's greatest admiral would be dead. Hunted from the sky by these same twin-tailed machines, the Zero, once invincible, was already a ghost of its former self. This is the story of the airplane that broke an empire's confidence in the sky, one climb at a time. If you're one of the generation that remembers these stories, we're honored. You're here. What year were you born? The bombers droned steady through the tropical air, and above them, in a loose formation of Mitsubishi fighters, an unnamed pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy scanned the horizon out of habit more than fear. Fear had never been part of his vocabulary. Not after 3 years of war, not after China, not after the long triumphant sweep through the Philippines and Java and Burma, where his Zero had proven itself the finest fighting machine in the sky. He had been trained to believe, and had come to believe with his whole heart, that no enemy aircraft alive could outturn him, outclimb him, or outfly him. That morning above Guadalcanal, that belief was still intact. It would not survive the hour. Far below, the island itself seemed to breathe heat and rot in equal measure. Thick green jungle pressed against the edges of the airstrip, steam rising from the canopy in the early morning light. And the coral dust of Henderson Field still bore the scars of weeks of shelling and bombing from both sides. Men on the ground, Japanese and American alike, had learned to hate this place with a passion that transcended the war itself. A place where malaria killed as efficiently as bullets, where the air itself felt like an enemy. From altitude, none of that misery was visible. From altitude, the war still looked clean. Mathematical, a matter of angles and speed and the discipline of formation flying. The pilot trusted that cleanliness. He had built his entire sense of the war around it. Below and behind them, near the captured airstrip the Americans called Henderson Field, something rose from the dust and coral of that shattered, war-weary island. At first it looked wrong, almost like two aircraft flying impossibly close together, twin bombs, twin tails, a single pod suspended between them where a pilot sat encased in glass and metal. The Japanese pilot had heard whispers of such a machine from intelligence briefings back at Rabaul, dismissed in a sentence or two as a curiosity. A heavy, clumsy twin-engine oddity that posed no real threat to a nimble single-seat fighter. Twin-engine aircraft, his superiors had explained, with the confidence of men who had never seen one in combat, could never match the tight turning radius that made the Zero deadly. The briefing had ended there. No one had thought to ask what such an aircraft might do if it simply refused to turn at all. He watched the strange twin-boomed shapes climb from the airfield below, and for a long moment his mind refused to process what his eyes were reporting. The rate of climb was wrong, not wrong in the way a clumsy aircraft climbs. Straining and slow, but wrong in the way a nightmare is wrong. Too fast, too smooth, Defying everything he had been taught about the physics of flight, within minutes the American fighters had passed through his altitude and kept climbing, gaining height that his own aircraft would need far longer to reach, if it could reach it at all under full combat load. The date was November 18th, 1942. And pilots of the American 339th Fighter Squadron had just become the first Lightning pilots to engage Japanese aircraft in combat. Neither he nor his squadron mates understood yet that they were witnessing the first crack in 3 years of unbroken Japanese air dominance. To understand the shock of that morning, one has to understand the world as this pilot and his comrades believed it to be since the 7th of December, 1941. Japanese naval aviators had swept across the Pacific wearing an aura of invincibility so complete it had become a kind of religion. The Mitsubishi Zero, with its extraordinary range, its whisper-light control response, and its tight turning radius, had earned a reputation that bordered on legend. At its critical altitude, the Zero could reach speeds approaching 332 miles per hour, respectable numbers for its era. But its true weapon was not raw speed. It was maneuverability. In a turning fight, a Zero could bend inside the flight path of nearly any Allied aircraft sent against it, sliding onto an enemy's tail before that enemy fully understood the fight had begun. The early months of 1942 seemed to confirm everything the Japanese believed about their own superiority. Obsolete Brewster Buffaloes fell burning over Singapore. Curtiss P-40 Warhawks were decimated over the skies of Java. British Hurricanes, proud symbols of an empire that had once ruled unchallenged, were swept aside over Burma with almost contemptuous ease. Japanese pilots did not merely win these engagements, they dominated them, and each victory deepened a collective certainty that Western pilots, however brave, simply lacked the skill and the aircraft to compete with Japan's naval aviators. Training in China had refined tactics that no other air force in the world could match. And the Zero itself, light and lethal, seemed the perfect instrument of that training. Among the pilots who carried this confidence into battle were men whose names would later become legendary within Japanese naval aviation. Veterans of the long China campaign who had already claimed dozens of victories before Guadalcanal became a name anyone in Tokyo needed to remember. These men did not fear American or British aircraft. They respected competent pilots when they met them. But they did not fear the machines. Those pilots flew. Their commanding officers spoke of the enemy in terms that reflected this confidence. Briefing pilots before missions, with assessments built entirely on the assumption that whatever appeared over the Solomon Islands would be a variation on aircraft they had already defeated. Carrier-based fighters, most likely perhaps a handful of Army pursuit planes, slow and outdated, nothing, in short, that a well-flown Zero could not handle. But intelligence reports trickling back to squadrons in the middle of 1942 spoke of something different, something that did not fit neatly into existing categories. Twin engines, twin tails, heavy weaponry concentrated in a single nose-mounted battery rather than spread across two wings. Most squadron commanders read these reports and set them aside. How could a heavy twin-engine aircraft possibly threaten a fighter as nimble as the Zero? Japanese naval doctrine, built around the idea of decisive individual combat and the supremacy of the turning dogfight, simply had no framework for understanding what was coming. The doctrine had been forged in an era when maneuverability was the only currency that mattered in the sky. Nobody in a position of command had yet considered what might happen if an enemy pilot refused to spend that currency at all, choosing instead to fight from above, diving and climbing rather than turning, using speed and altitude as weapons in their own right. The aircraft climbing from Henderson Field that November morning was the answer to a question American engineers had been asking since early 1937. when the United States Army Air Corps issued a specification for a long-range interceptor unlike anything flying at the time. A design team in California had answered that call with something almost audacious in its ambition: a fighter built around two powerful engines rather than one, capable of speeds and altitudes that seemed, on paper, difficult to believe. It had not arrived in the Pacific with fanfare. Early models suffered mechanical problems that delayed their combat debut, and more than a few experienced pilots eyed the strange twin-boom silhouette with open skepticism when it first appeared on Australian airfields. But by late 1942, those early problems were being solved, and pilots who had cut their teeth flying Warhawks against the Zero, men who had learned through hard and often fatal experience never to turn with the Zero, began transitioning into the new aircraft. They brought with them a single, hard-won piece of wisdom: do not fight the Zero on its own terms. The new fighter, it would turn out, gave them exactly the tool they needed to fight on terms of their own choosing. Instead, above Henderson Field that morning, the Japanese pilot had no way of knowing any of this. All he knew was what his eyes told him, and what his eyes told him contradicted everything 3 years of war had taught him to believe. The American fighters continued climbing, gaining altitude his squadron could not easily match, moving into position above the bombers he was meant to protect. When the engagement came, it did not unfold like the dogfights he had trained for. The American pilots did not close in for a turning fight. They dove from above, guns blazing, in short, violent bursts, then climbed away before he or his squadron mates could bring their own guns to bear. It was fast, brutal, and almost impossible to counter. By the time the American fighters broke off and climbed back toward the safety of altitude, 3 Japanese aircraft had fallen from the sky, and a silence settled over the surviving pilots that had nothing to do with the roar of engines. The flight back to Rabaul took hours, long enough for the shock to settle into something heavier, something closer to dread. The pilot found himself replaying the engagement again and again, searching for the moment he could have done something differently. And finding none, there had been no moment. The fight had been decided before it began. Decided the instant the American fighters reached an altitude his own aircraft simply could not touch. He thought of the men he had lost that morning, young faces he had shared meals with only days before, and felt for the first time in 3 years of war a sensation he did not have a name for. It was not quite fear. It was closer to doubt, and doubt was a stranger thing entirely. For a man raised to believe doubt was itself a kind of weakness. When he returned to Rabaul that evening, the pilot stood before his squadron commander and struggled to find the words twin engine, twin tails, climbing like nothing he had ever seen, dictating the terms of the fight from an altitude his own aircraft could barely reach. His commander listened, arms folded, his face unreadable in the lamplight of the command tent, and for a long moment said nothing at all. Outside, the sound of other engines idling on the airstrip filled the silence, mechanics shouting over the noise, the ordinary business of war continuing as though nothing had changed. The report would travel up the chain of command over the following days, one small voice among many, easy to dismiss as an anomaly, a single bad encounter in a war, otherwise still favoring the rising sun. But it would not be forgotten. It could not be forgotten, because within weeks, other pilots would return with the same story, the same shaken confidence, the same impossible climb rate burned into their memory. The mathematics of aerial supremacy were being rewritten, not in the training manuals. That still emphasized the turning dogfight above all else, but in the cold, unforgiving reality of altitude, speed, and firepower And though no one in the Imperial Japanese Navy yet understood it, the confidence of the rising sun had already begun, quietly and irreversibly, to collapse. The story of that November morning above Guadalcanal was not an isolated incident. It was the opening note of a pattern that would repeat itself in different skies, with different pilots, for the better part of 2 years. And to understand why it repeated so consistently, one has to understand what made the American fighter so fundamentally different from anything Japanese pilots had faced before. The difference was not simply a matter of 2 engines instead of 1. It was a difference in philosophy, in the very question of what a fighter aircraft was supposed to be. The Mitsubishi Zero had been built around a single, ruthless priority: weight. Every excess pound had been stripped from its airframe in the name of maneuverability, and that philosophy had produced a machine capable of astonishing feats in a turning fight. An aircraft that could bend and pivot through the sky with a lightness that felt almost alive under a skilled pilot's hand. But that lightness came at a terrible cost. The early Zero carried no armor plating behind the pilot's seat. Its fuel tanks were not self-sealing, meaning a single well-placed bullet could turn the aircraft into a torch within seconds. Its designers had made a calculated bet that maneuverability and pilot skill would keep the aircraft out of harm's way long enough that armor and self-sealing tanks would never be needed. For the first year of the war, that bet had paid off spectacularly. The engineers behind the Zero had faced an almost impossible set of demands from the Imperial Japanese Navy: a fighter with the range to escort bombers across vast stretches of ocean, the climb rate to intercept enemy aircraft quickly, and the agility to win any dogfight it entered, all while operating from the cramped decks of aircraft carriers. Meeting those demands simultaneously had required sacrifices elsewhere, and armor protection had been the first casualty for pilots who trusted their own skill above all else. That sacrifice had seemed a fair trade. Few of them imagined an enemy might one day design an aircraft that made personal skill almost irrelevant. The American twin-engine fighter had been built around an entirely different bet. Its designers in California, led by a young engineer whose gift for solving impossible problems had already made him something of a legend within the company, had wagered everything on power, altitude, and survivability rather than raw agility. 2 Allison engines, each producing over 1,000 horsepower and fitted with turbo superchargers that maintained their output at altitudes where other engines gasped and faded, gave the aircraft a rate of climb that seemed almost to defy belief. At sea level, it could climb at nearly 4,750 feet per minute, a figure that dwarfed anything the Zero's single radial engine could match, once altitude began stealing away its horsepower. By 20,000 feet, the Zero's engine, so potent near the ground, had lost roughly a fifth of its power, wheezing along at barely 750 horsepower, while the American fighter's turbo superchargers kept both engines breathing as though they were still at sea level. The turbo supercharger itself was a marvel of engineering. Few Japanese designers had the industrial base to replicate its scale, a system that used exhaust gases otherwise wasted to spin a turbine, forcing extra pressurized air into the engine and effectively tricking it into believing it was still flying near the ground, even at extreme altitude. It was a technology that demanded precision manufacturing, specialized alloys capable of withstanding enormous heat, and a level of quality control that Japanese wartime industry, strained by shortages and stretched supply lines, struggled to match. The result was an aircraft that only grew more dangerous the higher it flew, precisely the opposite of everything Japanese pilots had come to expect from their own machine. This single fact, more than any other, explained everything that had happened above Henderson Field. The Zero's famous turning radius meant nothing if the enemy simply refused to descend into the altitude band where that advantage applied, and the American pilots many of them veterans who had already learned bitter lessons flying older aircraft against the Zero, understood this instinctively. They had been taught through the deaths of friends and squadron mates, one commandment above all others: never turn with a Zero, use altitude, use speed, strike once from above, and climb away before the enemy can respond. It was a philosophy that traded the romance of the classic dogfight for something colder and far more effective. A philosophy the Japanese, wedded to their doctrine of decisive individual combat, would take years to fully understand and would never quite manage to counter. Nowhere was this new reality felt more sharply than at Rabaul, the sprawling Japanese airbase that served as the nerve center for operations across the Solomon Islands in eastern New Guinea. Among the pilots stationed there through the first half of 1943 was Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, already earning a formidable reputation among his squadron mates as one of the finest fighter pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy. A quiet, intensely focused aviator whose skill in a turning fight bordered on the uncanny. He had flown with distinction in earlier campaigns, and his comrades regarded him with a mixture of awe and quiet relief. The sense that as long as he flew beside them, the odds tilted slightly back in their favor. But even he found himself adapting his own tactics as the months wore on, learning through repeated, costly encounters that the old rules no longer applied. He had built his reputation the traditional way, through countless hours in the air, honing an instinctive feel for his aircraft, and through the slow accumulation of victories against opponents willing to meet him in the kind of close, turning fight where his skill could decide the outcome. The new American fighters offered him almost none of those opportunities. They came from above, fired once, and were gone, before his years of training could translate into a single, meaningful maneuver. For a pilot who had spent his entire career mastering the art of the turn, flying against an enemy who refused to turn at all felt less like combat and more like being hunted by something that did not play by the same rules. He had spent his life learning. Word spread through the squadrons at Rabaul with the particular urgency reserved for matters of survival. The new American fighters, the ones with the strange twin tails, did not linger to trade turns. They appeared from high above, often from directions that made them nearly impossible to spot against the sun, dove through Japanese formations with a burst of concentrated gunfire from the nose-mounted battery, and climbed away before a Zero pilot could bring his own guns to bear. Pilots who tried to follow them into the climb found their engines straining uselessly against gravity, while the American fighters continued upward, untroubled. Pilots who tried to outturn them below the danger zone occasionally succeeded, but the encounters had grown rare because American pilots increasingly refused to be lured into that kind of fight at all. Above roughly 250 miles per hour, the Zero's control surfaces grew heavy and sluggish in a pilot's hand. Above 300 miles per hour, the aircraft became genuinely difficult to maneuver, robbed of the very quality that had made it so feared. The American fighter, its later models fitted with hydraulically assisted ailerons, remained responsive even in steep dives approaching 500 miles per hour, a speed regime in which the Zero simply could not follow. The firepower disparity compounded the problem. Japanese fighters carried a mix of rifle-caliber machine guns and slower firing cannons spread across the wing, weapons that required careful calculation of convergence points to concentrate their fire effectively at a given range. The American fighter carried its entire arsenal, heavy machine guns and a single cannon, clustered together in the nose, firing in a straight, undeviating stream that needed no convergence calculation at all. A single accurate burst from that concentrated battery could tear an unarmored Zero apart in a fraction of a second, and even when the American fighter itself took damage, Its twin-engine design offered a margin of safety the Zero pilots could only envy. A Zero pilot whose single engine failed over open ocean faced a stark choice between a controlled ditching into shark-infested water or a slow, silent drift toward death as fuel ran out. With no realistic hope of rescue, an American pilot whose aircraft absorbed a hit to one engine could often nurse the surviving engine home, landing on a single propeller rather than disappearing into the sea. That difference in survivability meant something subtle but corrosive over time. Japanese pilots flew every mission, knowing a single mechanical failure or a single well-placed bullet in the wrong place could be a death sentence with no possibility of appeal, while their American counterparts flew with a quiet confidence that their aircraft, however damaged, would very often bring them home. Pilots at Rabaul began speaking of the new enemy in tones that had not existed a year earlier, tones that acknowledged, however reluctantly, a machine and a tactic they did not yet know how to defeat. The psychological weight of this shift settled over the squadrons gradually. Then all at once, men who had flown into battle for 3 years, secure in the knowledge that their aircraft and their training gave them the advantage, now found themselves scanning the sky above with a wariness that bordered on paranoia, aware that death could arrive from directly overhead with almost no warning. The turbo-supercharged engines of the American fighters ran quieter at altitude than the roaring radial engines Japanese pilots were accustomed to hearing before an attack, and more than one pilot would later describe the eerie sensation of never hearing the enemy until tracers were already streaking past the canopy. The aircraft earned a reputation among Japanese aviators as something almost supernatural in its ability to appear without warning, strike, and vanish back into the high sky before a counterattack could be organized. By the early months of 1943, that reputation was no longer confined to whispered squadron talk. It had begun appearing in careful and understated language in official assessments passed among Japanese naval aviation staff, assessments that acknowledged, however reluctantly, that engaging the new American fighter under anything but the most favorable circumstances was a gamble few pilots could expect to win. It was an extraordinary admission for a service built on the doctrine of aggressive, decisive combat, a doctrine that had never before counseled its pilots to avoid a fight rather than seek one out. Nothing would demonstrate the full weight of this shift more dramatically than the events of the 18th of April, 1943, a mission that began not in the cockpit of a fighter but in the quiet, secretive work of code breakers half a world away. American intelligence had intercepted and decrypted a Japanese naval message detailing the travel itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the most revered strategist in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The message revealed that Yamamoto intended to conduct an inspection tour of forward air bases in the Solomon Islands, traveling aboard a bomber with a small escort of Zero fighters, adhering with almost fatal precision to a published schedule. The mission to intercept that flight fell to a squadron of American fighters based far to the south, and it demanded something no other aircraft in the Pacific theater could realistically deliver: a flight of more than 400 miles each way, nearly 1,000 miles round trip, much of it skimming barely 50 feet above open ocean to avoid Japanese radar. Navigated with nothing but compass headings and dead reckoning across featureless water, timed to arrive at a specific point in the sky within a margin of a single minute. Only the long-range twin-engine American fighter possessed the fuel capacity and navigational reliability to attempt such a flight and still have enough combat fuel remaining to fight once it arrived. 18 of these fighters departed that morning under the command of Major John Mitchell, who had personally calculated the intercept course, though 2 turned back with engine trouble before reaching open water, leaving 16 to press on, flying low and silent across the water for nearly 2 hours before climbing to altitude at the precise moment their navigation told them they should Radio silence was absolute for the entire outbound leg. Every pilot alone, with the drone of his own engines and the endless gray-blue expanse of ocean sliding past just 50 feet below his wings, close enough that a moment of inattention could mean flying straight into the water. There was no margin for navigational error on a flight of this length. A few degrees of drift, uncorrected over nearly 2 hours, could mean missing the intercept point entirely, arriving too late, too early, or too far off course to find the target at all. Every pilot in that formation understood that the entire mission rested on dead reckoning alone. Compass headings and elapsed time calculated by hand before takeoff and trusted completely once the coastline behind them disappeared. Among the Zero pilots providing escort that day was Kenji Yanagiya, a young aviator who would later describe in careful and measured words the shock of what happened next. The American fighters seemed to materialize from nowhere, diving out of the morning sky with an economy of motion that left almost no time to react. Within seconds, the lead bomber carrying Admiral Yamamoto was falling toward the jungle canopy of Bougainville in flames, and the escorting Zeros, caught at a disadvantageous altitude and unable to intervene in time, could do nothing but watch the American pilots, having executed their attack with what the surviving escort pilot would later call frightening precision, climbed away and turned for home before an effective counterattack could be mounted. Their fuel margins so narrow that several aircraft would land with only minutes of flight time remaining. The death of Admiral Yamamoto sent a shockwave through the Imperial Japanese Navy that went far beyond the loss of a single commander. However irreplaceable he may have been, it confirmed, in the most brutal and public way imaginable, that the American twin-engine fighter was not merely a tactical nuisance but a strategic threat capable of reaching targets and executing plans with a level of precision. Japanese forces could not reliably counter or even anticipate. Word of the mission's success spread quickly among American squadrons, and though details remained classified for years, the pilots who had flown it understood immediately the magnitude of what they had accomplished for Japanese naval aviation. The mission represented something close to a violation, a demonstration that no distance, no altitude, and no escort could guarantee safety any longer. News of the Admiral's death was kept from the Japanese public for more than a month. Announced only once, officials had carefully prepared a narrative befitting a national hero. But within the Naval Air Service itself, the truth of how he had died spread quickly through quiet, disbelieving conversations between pilots who understood exactly what kind of aircraft had made such an attack possible. If the Americans could reach the Empire's most protected commander, escorted and traveling deep within what should have been secure airspace, then no one, they realized, was truly safe anymore. In the months that followed, official guidance filtering down to Japanese squadrons grew increasingly explicit in its caution. Pilots were advised to avoid direct engagement with the twin-engine American fighters, except under conditions of overwhelming numerical advantage or favorable positioning, language that represented a quiet but unmistakable reversal of a warrior culture that had always emphasized seeking out combat rather than evading it. For pilots trained from their earliest days to believe that retreat carried a stain no victory could erase, these instructions landed with a particular bitterness. Men who had once flown toward the enemy without hesitation now found themselves calculating odds before engaging. A habit of mind that felt, to many of them, like a betrayal of everything they had been taught to be. On the American side, the growing effectiveness of the twin-engine fighter produced its own quiet transformation, embodied most visibly in the rise of a handful of young pilots whose skill and discipline turned the aircraft's inherent advantages into extraordinary personal records. Richard Bong, a young flight officer from the American Midwest, initially better known among his commanders for reckless low-altitude stunts than for combat discipline, channeled that same aggressive confidence into a series of methodical, carefully executed attacks that saw his victory count climb steadily through 1943 and into the following year. Thomas McGuire, a former enlisted man who had worked his way into flight training through sheer persistence, developed a reputation for patient, calculating attacks that rarely gave the enemy any opportunity to fight back on favorable terms. Between them, these two pilots would eventually account for nearly 80 confirmed victories, every one of them achieved in the twin-engine fighter. Numbers that exceeded what most Japanese aces, flying for years longer, had ever managed to claim. Neither man fit the popular image of the reckless daredevil so often associated with fighter aces. Both approached their work with a discipline that bordered on obsession, studying enemy formations before committing to an attack, patiently climbing for altitude advantage rather than accepting a fight on less favorable terms, and breaking off engagements that offered no clear opening rather than pressing a fight out of pride. It was precisely this patience, this willingness to let the aircraft's advantages do the work, rather than forcing a confrontation, that separated the most successful American pilots from those who struggled or died attempting to fight the Zero on its own terms. In the twin-engine fighter, patience was not a limitation. It was a weapon in its own right. And the pilots who understood that fact best became the ones whose names would be remembered. Their success was not simply a matter of individual talent, though talent certainly played its part. It reflected a systematic advantage that extended from the drawing boards of California through the training pipelines of the American military and into the skies over the Pacific. American pilots arriving in combat squadrons by 1943 typically carried between 400 and 600 hours of flight training behind them. Hours spent not only learning to fly, but studying gun camera footage from actual combat engagements, refining tactics that had already proven successful against the Zero, and training specifically on the complexities of twin-engine operation. Japanese pilot training, by contrast, had begun to erode under the strain of sustained losses, compressed from a rigorous multi-year program into something closer to 6 months, producing replacements who arrived at frontline squadrons with barely 200 hours in the air and little practical experience against an enemy who no longer fought by the old rules. Behind that widening gap in flight hours lay an even wider gap in industrial capacity, one that no amount of individual courage could close. American factories, drawing on assembly line techniques refined over decades of automobile manufacturing, could produce these twin-engine fighters by the thousands, each one built to precise, interchangeable tolerances that simplified repair and kept squadrons flying even in the primitive conditions of forward Pacific airstrips. Japanese aircraft production, by contrast, remained far more dependent on skilled hand-fitting and individual craftsmanship, a method that produced excellent aircraft in small numbers, but could never hope to match the sheer volume rolling out of American factories. Every Zero lost above Rabaul or the Solomons had to be replaced not just with a new airframe, but with months of increasingly compressed training for the young man who would fly it, a debt that compounded with every passing month of the campaign. The gap this created was not merely statistical, it was lived day after day in the cockpits over Rabaul and the Solomons, where seasoned Japanese pilots watched their formations thin as replacements arrived undertrained and left all too often in their first or second engagement. The aircraft that had seemed, in the war's opening months, an unstoppable expression of Japanese martial skill, now found itself facing an enemy that had turned aerial combat into something closer to an engineering problem, one to be solved through altitude, firepower, training pipelines, and industrial capacity. Rather than individual heroism alone, the Zero remained a formidable aircraft in the hands of a skilled pilot under the right conditions, but the right conditions were growing rarer by the month, and the twin-engine fighter, patient and merciless from above, was the reason why, by the middle of 1944, the men who had once flown into battle with absolute confidence were flying instead with the quiet fatalism of soldiers who understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the war in the air had already been decided against them. The desperate measures that followed reflected that understanding as much as any official strategy did. Japanese engineers, racing against time and dwindling resources, attempted at last to build a twin-engine fighter of their own, the Kawasaki Ki, Ratos Dua, a machine meant to answer the American aircraft on something closer to equal terms. It did not enter service until 1945, years after its American counterpart had already reshaped the war, and only a small number were ever completed. It proved slower, climbed more sluggishly, and suffered from chronic engine troubles that limited its usefulness even in the rare instances it reached the front. The aircraft that might have leveled the playing field had arrived far too late to matter, a painful monument to how completely Japan's industrial capacity had fallen behind. Fewer than 240 of these Japanese twin-engine fighters were ever built, a fraction of the more than 10,000 examples of their American counterpart that rolled off assembly lines before the war's end. And by the time the handful that reached operational units took to the air, there were barely enough experienced pilots left alive to fly them effectively. What should have been a turning point arrived, instead, as a footnote, a technological answer delivered to a question that had already been settled in the skies over Guadalcanal. New Guinea and the open waters near Bougainville years earlier, other countermeasures fared little better. Squadron commanders experimented with staggered formations at multiple altitudes, hoping to spot the twin-engine fighters before they could dive unseen out of the sun. They tried using cloud cover for concealment, only to find that the American fighters, faster and better equipped for navigation, could search vast stretches of sky in a fraction of the time it once would have taken. Some pilots, recognizing that conventional combat offered them almost no realistic chance of survival, began deliberately ramming enemy aircraft when their guns failed or their ammunition ran dry, a tactic born less of strategy than of desperation. None of these adaptations addressed the fundamental problem, the gap between the two aircraft, and increasingly between the two air forces that flew them, had grown too wide to close through tactics alone. The consequences of that gap became devastatingly clear in June of 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when American carrier pilots shot down staggering numbers of Japanese aircraft for almost negligible losses of their own. The battle would later be remembered by American aviators with a nickname that captured its lopsided nature with brutal simplicity, and though the twin-engine fighter itself played only an indirect role that day, its fingerprints were everywhere in the outcome. Years of attrition against these aircraft over the Solomons and New Guinea had already stripped Japan of the experienced pilots who might have made a difference, leaving carrier squadrons filled with young men who had barely mastered takeoff and landing, let alone the split-second decision-making that aerial combat demanded. The battle was not truly decided over the waters of the Philippine Sea that June. It had been decided months and years earlier, in 100 smaller engagements over jungle-covered islands where Japan's best pilots had been worn away, one by one. Survivors of that battle who made it back to their carriers described a sky that seemed to have turned against them entirely, filled with enemy fighters at every altitude, offering no safe corridor home and no formation dense enough to offer real protection. Ground crews aboard the carriers counted the aircraft returning that evening and found whole squadrons simply gone. vanished into the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea, along with the young men who had flown them, most with only weeks of operational experience behind them. By early 1945, the language Japanese pilots used to describe their situation had shifted again, and this final shift was perhaps the most telling of all. They no longer spoke of air superiority, a concept that belonged to an earlier, more confident phase of the war. They no longer even spoke of achieving rough parity with their enemy. They spoke instead, quietly and without illusion, of survival, of simply making it home from a given mission. The organized, doctrine-driven confidence that had carried Japanese naval aviation across the opening months of the war had been replaced by something far grimmer, a growing reliance on tactics that asked young men to trade their lives directly for whatever damage they could inflict. Since the older calculus of skill defeating machine no longer applied, training programs, already compressed to a fraction of their pre-war length, continued shrinking as the need for replacement pilots grew ever more desperate. Many of the young men sent into combat during the war's final year had accumulated barely 100 hours of flight time before facing an enemy whose pilots typically arrived with 4 to 6 times that experience, flying aircraft that outperformed theirs in nearly every measurable category. The human cost of this imbalance is difficult to convey through statistics alone. Though the statistics themselves are staggering, by the war's end, Japan had lost the overwhelming majority of the experienced naval aviators who had begun the conflict with such confidence in 1941, men whose skill and training could never be replaced quickly enough to matter. The pilots who took their place in the final years of the war were, in the plainest and most painful sense, sent up against odds their commanders understood to be nearly hopeless. Asked to fly obsolete aircraft against a technologically superior enemy with a fraction of the training their opponents received, many of them surely understood this themselves before they ever left the ground. They flew anyway, carrying forward a code of duty and sacrifice that had once been matched by genuine capability and was now, in the war's final chapter, tragically decoupled from any real chance of success. Squadron records from those final months read less like accounts of a functioning Air Force and more like a slow accounting of loss. Young names entered and, within days or weeks, crossed out again, replaced by younger names, still each one representing a family somewhere in Japan that would eventually receive word of a son who had not come home. The relentless mathematics that had first revealed themselves above Henderson Field in 1942 had, by the war's final year, worked their way through nearly the entire structure of Japanese naval aviation, leaving behind an air service that could still summon courage in abundance, but could no longer summon the machines or the trained men required to make that courage matter. Among the men who survived long enough to reflect on what had happened, few carried more weight or authority than Saburo Sakai, the fighter pilot whose reputation had once stood as one of the finest in Japanese naval aviation, a veteran of the China campaign and the brutal fighting over the Solomons, who had been severely wounded in combat in the summer of 1942 and spent much of the following year recovering from injuries that nearly cost him his sight. In the years after the war, as he set down his memories in writing, he returned again and again to the same painful conclusion, one shared quietly by many of his surviving comrades, even if few expressed it as directly as he eventually did. The American twin-engine fighter, more than any other single aircraft he encountered across years of combat, had broken something in the Japanese fighter pilot's sense of himself, not merely defeating him in the air, but undermining the very foundation of confidence and warrior identity that had defined his service from its earliest days. It was not, he reflected, simply a matter of one machine being faster or climbing higher than another. It represented an entire philosophy of war that Japan for all its courage and sacrifice, had never possessed the industrial means to match. That reflection captured something larger than the fate of a single aircraft or a single campaign. The years between 1942 and 1945 had witnessed the quiet, irreversible end of an idea that had once seemed self-evident to Japanese naval aviation. The idea that spirit, will, and courage could reliably overcome material disadvantage in the crucible of modern war. The Zero, which had swept unchallenged across the Pacific in the war's opening months, had by war's end become a symbol not of Japanese superiority, but of how quickly technological advantage could reverse the fortunes of even the most confident and battle-hardened Air Force. The pilots who had once dismissed the strange twin-boomed American fighter as too heavy and too clumsy to matter had learned, at a cost measured in thousands of lives, exactly how wrong that first assessment had been. The shock experienced by that unnamed pilot above Henderson Field in November of 1942, the disbelief of watching an enemy aircraft climb past him into a sky his own fighter could not reach, turned out to be the opening moment of a transformation that would ultimately reshape the entire war in the Pacific. What began as a single startling encounter above one blood-soaked island became, over the following 2.5 years, an unrelenting demonstration that altitude, speed, and industrial capacity could dictate the terms of aerial combat as surely as any individual pilot's skill or courage ever could. The twin-tailed fighter that first climbed from Henderson Field that morning did not simply win battles in the years that followed. It quietly, systematically dismantled the confidence of an Air Force that had once believed itself unbeatable. One climb, one dive, and one shattered assumption at a time, until the empire that had built its entire vision of victory around that confidence had nothing left in the sky to defend it with.